What's going on YouTube? It's Chris bringing you guys another Fantasy Puck video, and I'm really excited about this video. I've been kind of working on it all week periodically, so hopefully you guys enjoy, especially with all of the questions and stuff and people's trade deadlines coming up for their fantasy hockey season and the NHL trade deadline coming up. I wanted to do kind of like a trade tutorial video explaining the best way for you guys to go about trading players, acquiring players, whatever it is that you're focused on. We're going to cover everything in this video. It's going to be a little bit in depth. I don't know how long it's going to take. I'm going to try and keep it short for you guys, but everything should be available on screen for you guys. So let's go over the checklist right away. This is essentially what you guys want to follow. And I broke it down kind of into 5 steps for you guys. So the first one is identify your team's strengths and weaknesses, find out who's available, understanding a player's true value, use external resources to evaluate players, and review your upcoming playoff schedule. This is kind of the process that I take whenever I go to try and make a trade in fantasy hockey. And before we get started, I understand that, a lot of people play fantasy hockey for fun. That's totally okay. If you guys want to make trades for the sake of making trades and you enjoy that part of fantasy hockey, by all means, go ahead. This video is going to be primarily focused on the people that are trying to win their league or trying to put themselves in a better position next year to win their league. So again, if you play fantasy hockey casually and it's for fun, totally get that. Again, nothing wrong with that. This video is going to be a little bit more in-depth than our usual content. So if you're interested in that, hopefully you guys enjoy. Like I said, put a lot of effort into this. Let's get started. Before we even start with the checklist, this is something that I see a lot of the time in Discords. I feel like a lot of you guys just make trades for the sake of making trades, and you're either trading away elite players or you're trying to acquire elite players, and you're kind of just doing it with no real purpose. So this is something to follow when you're looking to improve your team. So these are kind of some key points that I kind of look for if you're in a position to win is a big one. So obviously, like if you're in a position to win your league, if you're in your top 3, top 5, whatever it is, depending on your league size, if you're in a position to win and you feel like you have a very good team available to you, you're looking to improve your team, obviously a trade deadline to try and push yourself over the top to make sure you win, especially when you're playing for money. Like this is something that's very important. Another good point is you're currently trying to make the playoffs. So depending on where you are, and depending on how tight the race is, if you're really just trying to get yourself into the playoffs, you're like, look, for whatever reason, I went through a bunch of injuries, which we'll touch on in a second. I'm just trying to make it into the playoffs. I need to add something to my team to make sure I get in. This is a good opportunity to look to improve your team. Another good option is when you find and this is what I see a lot of you guys on, and a lot of you guys actually do a really good job on, is finding a good buy low opportunity or the opportunity to add an elite player. These don't come up very often, and there's a reason why we do things like league winning trades, because number one, like they don't occur very often throughout the season, and there's an opportunity to leverage yourself into getting an elite player or getting somebody that is a really good player that just isn't performing for like the first quarter of the season or the last month or so. So there's a lot of opportunity here to drastically improve your team with one move. Another good option when you're looking to improve your team, if you've had a significant injury and you're still in a position to win. So say, for example, let's say McKinnon goes down, right? And you have McKinnon on your team. And your team is sitting in a playoff spot right now, and you don't know how long McKinnon's going to be out for. He could be coming back. He could be, out for longer than anticipated. You need to make sure that you're still in the run or you're getting a good spot in the standings to get a good playoff matchup round 1. This is a good opportunity to improve your team. You're obviously not going to be able to replace Nathan McKinnon if he goes down, but you want to look for something to help you while McKinnon's out and you're in a dire need to either make the playoffs or, like I said, you're in a good position to win. You don't want to look for a trade if you suffer a significant injury and you're nowhere near a position to win, right? Like if you're just on the bubble and say McKinnon goes down, like chances are, depending on how long McKinnon is out for, it's not going to, you're hurting yourself more by trading away assets and picks to try and make up for McKinnon being out than you would if you're in like 2 weeks out of playoffs and like you have a significant player go down. Like that's one thing, right? So you got to kind of remember that you don't want to, like it's going to hurt you more than it's going to benefit you, if that makes sense. And then if your team is struggling in multiple categories that are costing you wins, this is something that, again, you should be keeping track of throughout the season. And this is, again, specific to category type leagues and head-to-head type leagues, if you're just getting absolutely like dunked on in like 3 or 4 categories, like say it's strictly goaltending, right? It's like you're just losing goals against, you're losing save percentage, you're losing wins every week. Sooner or later, if you're in a good spot, you need to address that concern if you plan on trying to make a deep playoff run, right? So you kind of got to make all these decisions prior to making moves, because if you're just trading for the sake of trading, you might end up giving up, like I said, more assets that is going to hurt you next year if your team's not actually competitive than it would benefiting your team going forward. So just a couple things to look for. When to look to trade away players. Big one right off the start in keeper leagues, if your team's tanking for next year. I'm currently in a league where we do a little bit of like a cycle when it comes to keepers. So you can only keep a player for a certain amount of years. So say, for example, you draft McDavid. In my league, you can only keep him for the year that you draft him and then 2 more years after that. And then he gets put back into the draft. So we have a very significant draft coming up next year where all of the high-end players that have been kept every single year essentially are going back into the draft. So I made the decision earlier on, and this was partially because of last year as well too. And I kind of went all in last year to try and make a deep playoff run. And I picked really, really late this year. So I've been kind of tanking and trading away my assets to try and get picks for this big upcoming draft. Same thing. It's the same thing if you feel like your team is out of it in like a season long, for example, and you want to try and acquire a bunch of picks for next year in a keeper league. Good opportunity to trade away players. Another good one is when a player has consistently struggled for the majority of the season. The key words here are consistently and majority. So this is another thing that I see a lot of you guys do when you're like, oh, Austin Matthews hasn't put up 60 goals yet this season. I'm looking to trade him away. Maybe I can get a whole bunch of players in return. You guys have to understand that sample size is a really important thing. And we'll touch on sample size a little bit later in the checklist. But just because a player has struggled for, like I saw it with Nietzsche this year too, and Trocheck. Just because a player has struggled in terms of production for a period of the season, that doesn't necessarily make him any less valuable. Now, there are some examples like Jonathan Huberdeau, Jacob Markstrom, where these players have consistently struggled throughout the majority of the season, and they could be costing your team's wins. That's a little bit of a different circumstance. So again, you really want to defer to large sample sizes of inconsistent or struggled or players that are struggling throughout the majority of the season when you look to trade away these kinds of players. Another good opportunity is when you find a buy low opportunity or an elite player. Same thing. If you're able to trade a player that is hot and you're selling, like say for example, it's Erik Karlsson, right? Erik Karlsson could get traded to another team. He might not be the same level of production because he might not play the exact same amount of minutes as he's playing in San Jose. And if you have the opportunity to get a good buy low player that's an elite player or an elite player altogether, you want to look to trade away, right? It's the same thing. It's the exact same thing as buy low, sell high. We cover it all the time on the channel. You guys should be aware of this by now. And then finally, your team is not in a position to win and you're looking to acquire picks. Again, good opportunity to trade away players, right? So that's kind of something to preface before we decide that we want to make trades. And again, like I see a lot of the time, like you guys are like every 2 days just looking to try and make a trade. And a lot of the time, like you have to sit and you have to acquire sample for your team and you have to understand, which is honestly what we're going to talk about. So let's get into it. So step number 1 is identify your team's strengths and weaknesses. Guys, use the team stat page. All you got to do is go on Yahoo, go on ESPN, go to your league, go to your team stats, and look at the record of what you've had throughout the entire season. Now, obviously, it's going to vary a little bit, and the sample is going to change. And usually what I like to do leading into playoffs is I like to take the sample of like the last 4 or 5 weeks instead of me looking at the entire duration of the season, because number 1, your team could change over the course of the season. Number 2, you could have injuries. There's a whole bunch of things that go into that. So I like to take at least a sample of the last month or month and a half of play to kind of determine where my team is at going into trade deadline. So use this as an example where it's like, okay, my team is very, very good at scoring goals and shooting the puck. Like, I get a lot of shots on goal. I score a lot of goals. I get a lot of power play points. But I am currently like 1 in 10 in the last 11 weeks when it comes to blocks. Or I'm 1 in 10 in wins in the last couple of weeks when it comes to goaltending, right? So use this to kind of gauge where your team is at this current moment in time. Another thing that I like to do is review previous matchups. And this gives you context, especially when you've rolled with a team and you haven't made a bunch of changes throughout the regular season. You get to kind of look at, okay, who are you matching up against? And again, it's not always going to be the same week every week. The matchups are going to change. I get that there's a lot of variance in that sense. But you get to fundamentally understand how close or how far you are from certain other teams in the league. So if you're playing a lot of the top 3 teams and you're losing to those top 3 teams in goaltending consistently, maybe that's something that you want to look at. And this leads into my other point, understanding other teams' strengths. There are some teams that, and you should be doing this obviously going into a draft. If you guys watch Mike's draft strategy, like, it's one thing to just grab like really good players and just have a really good team. A lot of the time, though, like in keeper leagues and in other leagues that count like a bunch of categories, for example, people go in with specific strategies. So it's like, okay, I want to have a high scoring team and I want to have good goaltending. That's my strategy for this year. So if you come across a team that you know has exceptionally good goaltending and just has happened to hit on like 3 of their goalies, and he's very scary because he can steal 3 or 4 categories each week just with his goaltending, you have to plan an answer for that if you match up against him in the playoffs. Right? So maybe if he's maybe if he has elite goaltending, maybe he struggles in some player categories. Right? So that's something that you need to have a fundamental understand on in your guys' league as well too. And then all this is going to help you determine how drastic of a change that you have to make. And again, like, you want to target elite players, you want to target players that are going to significantly impact your guys' team, but you don't always need to. And you need to decide who and what you're willing to give up prior to even going to the next step. This really helps you for a couple of reasons. Number one, when you have the opportunity to potentially get a really good player, you're usually going to have to give up a lot, right? So you have to come to terms with, am I willing to give this up? Do I want to give up my first? Do I want to keep my first next year? How's the draft looking next year? Is it season long? Is it keeper? Like, what's the situation like? So these are all things that are important to you guys and you need to understand going forward. Next, you want to find out who's available. Next step is just like this. And again, this is either the most or least frustrating part of your league, because depending on how active people are in your guys' league, very, very difficult to sometimes get a hold of people. Very, very difficult to sometimes get an answer out of people, depending on how active your league is, right? So this could be like a weekly process even. So some of you might have to get started a lot earlier than just the day of trade deadline if you're trying to get a hold of somebody. The other thing is, and this is something that I've been guilty of, don't be afraid to ask about elite players. So it doesn't matter if you think a player is untouchable, right? And I've done this before too. I haven't bothered to ask other teams and other owners, is this player or would you move this player? Because in my own head, I was just like, yeah, there's no way this guy moves Brady Tkachuk, or there's no way this guy moves Kyle Connor, or there's no way this guy moves Thatcher Demko. And so I won't even try sometimes because I'm like, well, I would never move this guy. Why would he? And a lot of the time you'll find that certain owners and certain players are valued differently in their minds than in your minds. A good point of reference to start is you want to start with the teams that aren't competing. If you're in a position to win, and it's exactly reversed, where if you're trying to sell, you want to sell to the teams that are competing because ideally they're trying to win the league. And that's just like a good place to start because they're going to be more willing to give up their better players for picks because they know that, they're not in it for this year. And then just what I like to do is start compiling a short list as well too. I get maybe like 2 or 3 players from each team or anybody that I can kind of get an answer from. I try and compile that list going forward just so that like I have a general idea of how they value those players and what I would be giving up to acquire those players. And then I can kind of choose and pick, what I'm willing to give up. And then again, this happens a lot in leagues. You want to find the players and the people that are uneducated and uninterested. And if you're serious about fantasy hockey, like totally get it. There's competitive leagues where everybody's involved. There's, some leagues where half the league is involved and the other half isn't involved. You want to target the guys that are uneducated and uninterested. Why? Because it gives you the opportunity to hit a home run and without giving up a lot, right? So, if they're unfamiliar or, like I said, uneducated or uninterested even in the season, it's just very easy to take advantage of them. I guess that morally that's not really the best way to put it, but at the end of the day, if you have money in this league, you want to win, right? That's what it is at the end of the day. And it happens all the time in fantasy football as well too. I get taken advantage of a lot of the time because I'm not as educated in fantasy football than I am in fantasy hockey. But you want to make sure that you're leveraging the most out of the people that, like I said, are uneducated and uninterested. Number 3, understanding a player's true value. So this is where it gets very specific for you guys. This is completely dependent on league scoring and your team strategy. What do I mean by that? Well, if you don't count hits in your league, then a guy like Timo Meier or Brady Tkachuk, they're valuable, but they're not as valuable as, say, hits would be. Same thing with a guy like Tanner Jeannot, Radko Gudas, like any one of those players. If you only count 2 goalie categories, chances are goalies are not that valuable in your guys' league. So you have to realize how many categories you have, how many player categories there are, how many goalie categories there are, what is going to benefit my team the most. And then another good point is making sure that you understand the basics of scarcity and abundance. So what I mean when I say scarcity and abundance is, for example, and you would know this because you went through the draft with this league essentially. I know that in my 2 competitive leagues that I'm in, with everybody being really good fantasy hockey owners, I know defensemen are going to go fast in the draft. And what that means is defensemen are scarce, right? Same with goaltending. There's only a handful of elite goaltenders. So typically, goalies, defensemen are going to be worth more than, say, a winger, right? This is only something that you'll be able to understand based off of, like I said, your league scoring and your team strategy. So, for example, if my team strategy is I want a team that hits all the peripheral categories like shots, hits, blocks. I know I can get hits from forwards. I know I can get shots from forwards and defensemen. But if I want to target the block category, I need elite defensemen that block because the majority of the blocks come from defensemen. So that makes that defense category a little bit more scarce. Guys like Alec Martinez, Ivan Provorov. So you want to be able to target those specific players if that's the strategy that you're going with. Look for players that impact multiple categories or have elite volume. These are the players that are going to impact your team the most. So look for these kinds of players. Brady Tkachuk is a great example. We like to use him a lot of the time just because of how insanely high his shot volume and his hit volume is. And when you find players like this, like him, Timo Meier, guys that hit multiple categories at elite volumes, these are the elite players. If you count faceoffs in your league, like Leon Draisaitl is an incredible player to have. He's dual eligible. He can put up 50 goals. He puts up usually 50 assists every season. He hovers around that 100-point mark. Elite on the power play. Takes a lot of faceoffs, but he doesn't really hit, doesn't really block. So again, elite in multiple categories, that determines an elite player's value. Start with where they're drafted. And Mike makes reference to this a lot of the time, not particularly in videos, but when answering your guys' questions, for example. So say, for example, if I drafted Martin Necas in the 15th round, which is where he could have gone, for example, I know that Martin Necas this season is not performing at a 15th round. I know that Martin Necas is somewhere in that 5 to 8 round range, right? Depending on the categories that you guys have. So I'm not going to trade away Martin Necas for a 15th round pick. But it also works the other way. So say, for example, I drafted Moritz Seider in the 3rd round. Now, Moritz Seider, I don't think has performed anywhere near the value of the 3rd round. But I'm not going to give up Moritz Seider for a 10th or an 11th round pick. I would rather hold on to Moritz Seider and hope that he has a better second half of the season. Like, you guys have to remember, like, where you drafted a player is a good place to start. right? So just keep that in mind as you're kind of valuing players. Now, this isn't always the case. Like I said, you could have a guy like Nietzsche where he's worth a lot more, or a guy like Seider who's worth a lot less. But typically, anywhere around that range, you want to kind of like look and see, oh, well, I got Linus Ullmark in the 8th round. He's the best goalie by far in fantasy hockey right now. Am I going to trade him away for a 4th round pick? Probably not. I probably want a first. Oh, I drafted Jacob Markstrom in the 3rd round this year. Is he performing anywhere close to a 3rd round pick? No. Is he costing my team categories? Maybe. If that's the case, I want to move him off my team. That's fine. But I'm not going to be like, yeah, give me a 15th round pick for Jacob Markstrom. Hopefully that makes sense for you guys. And then another really, really good point is find comparable players of different values. So say, for example, you want like a Brady Tkachuk. You ask the guy, can I get Brady Tkachuk? No. Okay. Who is comparable to Brady? Well, Evander Kane is back. He has a high shot volume, high hit volume. Maybe I can get Evander Kane. I don't think they're necessarily the same type of player in terms of value, but they're similar, right? Same thing with like guys like Trocheck and Bennett, right? Like those are guys that, yes, their production is lacking a little bit, but they hit a ton of categories like shots, hits, power play points. Like they hit goals and assists too. Obviously not at an elite level like say a McDavid would, but they make up for it from their hits, from their PIMs, for example, if you guys are in bangers leagues. So look at comparable players of different values. Like Pierre-Luc Dubois is another good example. He's been unbelievable this season as a fantasy hockey player, but you look at Pierre-Luc Dubois and you're like, oh, he's not an elite player, but he could be in your league. So just find comparable players of different values, for example. Same thing. A lot of the times you'll see like Kyle Connor, really elite when it comes to 4 categories, right? Like goals, assists, power play points, shots. I probably can't get Kyle Connor because he's doing so well this season and the owner wants to hang on to him. But I could get a guy like Jake DeBrusk, Ricard Raquel, Martin Nietzsche, who goals, assists, power play points, and shots, but not at the same level as, say, Kyle Connor is. All right, moving on. Use external resources to evaluate players. Guys, do not use the fantasy app projections and rankings. Don't ever trust Yahoo or ESPN. Even if you pay for the premium, if you pay for the premium, I'm praying for you. Don't ever use it. There's a lot of reasons why you shouldn't use it. They value certain players over others based off of their projections, which a lot of the time are inaccurate. And the start and drop suggestions are obviously inaccurate. So a lot of the time, you just want to ignore the actual app itself. Use a projection that you're familiar with and trust. And this is why, Mike and I use numbers a lot of the time and use advanced analytics and use projections, because it's basically to eliminate bias. And a lot of the time, bias is something that can get us into a lot of trouble when we're trading or acquiring players. So just that's something to keep an eye on. We do have a premium option available to you guys in our Patreon that uses player projections and a trade analyzer. So if you guys are interested in that, be sure to check that out. Now, other important things to look at, especially when acquiring players, and let's use Tarasenko, for example, right? Just got traded to the Rangers, going to be line 1, probably power play 1. They probably end up splitting their power play. We don't know yet, right? This could be the case for the first week, and then their coach might just completely change it up and throw Tarasenko in the third line, right? So when you're looking at things like average time on ice, power play time, line combinations, etc., you want to make sure that there is sample, and you're not just completely going off of recency bias, which is my next point. If you see, let's use Vincent Trocheck, for example. He gets moved down to the second power play unit, and he's there for about a week. And you're like, oh, no, Trocheck's on the second power play unit. Nothing's going to change, blah, 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 blah. I'm going to trade him. And then you go and look, and 2 weeks later, he's back on the top power play unit because the Rangers have decided to stack that top power play unit. And say, for example, Tarasenko's not, producing, or for whatever reason the power play stopped working, and they go back to what they had before because that was what was working. Then you've traded away an asset because of some recency bias. So you always want to find players that have a good sample size when it comes to average time on ice, power play, tight end, line combos. Just, it's the safest thing to do, and you don't want to get caught in that recency bias. And then another good external resource for you guys is our Discord. So if you guys are interested, the Discord link will be in the description. Join there. If you guys have any questions about trades or anything, especially with trade deadline coming around the corner, be sure that you're asking us questions in there. We'd be more than happy to help. Myself, Don, Mike, Sven's in there too now. We have a lot of guys that have a lot of experience in fantasy hockey that are willing to help you guys out. So use us as a resource as well too. And then finally, review your upcoming playoff schedules. Steps 1 and let's read this together. Steps 1 and 4 mean nothing if the player you trade for only plays 2 games in the first week of playoffs, right? If I go out and I acquire, I don't know, let's say it's Zibanejad. I go out and I acquire Zibanejad. He only plays twice in week 1. He's on my bench the majority of the time. Like, all this work and all this effort that I put into it is basically nullified because he doesn't really play. And he doesn't really help me in playoffs. Because at the end of the day, that's where you need to win in playoffs, right? If you're in head-to-head, especially, I'm strictly speaking from a head-to-head perspective. If you're in season long, obviously that's different. It's just, you want to make sure that they're playing the most in playoffs. Or it's not even the fact that you want players that are playing the most. It's just the fact that you don't want to have a situation where you go and you trade for an elite player and he only plays 2 games in one of the weeks, right? And then he just, like, you've traded a bunch of assets for nothing, essentially. So be sure to use our playoff schedule, which is available in our Discord. So if you guys are in our Discord already, definitely make sure that you go join. The link will be in the description down below. But use that playoff schedule as a resource to identify the best matchups. And again, this step shouldn't make or break your trade, but again, you don't want to overlook it. And it's a very, very critical step when it comes to trading for a goaltender, for example. Like, matchups are very important when you're trading for a goalie, especially if you're trading for a tandem-like player. Like, say you're like, okay, I want, let's say it's Matt Murray, for example. I know he's injured right now. I'm using it as an example because the Leafs typically are pretty good this year when it comes to wins, and and Murray's been, like, solid when it comes to just play as of late when he's been healthy. If the Leafs play 3 times in a week and they don't have a back-to-back, and we know at this point that Ilya Samsonov is the main starter for the Leafs, this is something that, again, could make or break my playoffs, right? Because if Murray doesn't play once and I go in and I trade for him, like, what's the point of me trading for him if he's not going to play for my team? This could also work in your favor, though. So if you go and look at the Avs has a very favorable playoff schedule. If they have a back-to-back and I'm able to scoop up Pavel Francouz for really, really cheap in a matchup against, say, it's like Arizona or Anaheim, like, I really like that matchup. That helps me a lot in the playoffs when it comes to my goaltending, right? So that's just, again, it shouldn't make or break your trade, but you just want to make sure that it doesn't completely, like, ruin everything in playoffs, because those are the only weeks that matter, right? So, guys, put a lot of effort into this video. Hopefully you guys enjoyed. If you did, please leave a like. That would be very much appreciated. Hopefully this gave you a little bit of insight. If you guys watch the entire video, just put puck as your comment. I just want to see how many people watch the entire video. Really appreciate you guys if you do. Again, I put a lot of effort into this, so hopefully you guys enjoyed. Hopefully you guys liked this more of an in-depth understanding. Be sure that you save this video if you need to go over it. Again, if you just want, like, a general kind of review on everything that you should go over before your trade checklist, it's all right there. Be sure that you save this video for whenever you guys are making trades or looking to do things like that in the future. Guys, again, thank you so much for watching. Really appreciate you guys with all the support and everything. Lots more fantasy hockey content coming soon. Have yourselves a fantastic rest of your day.